Joining us now is Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger, and he recently deployed to the southern border with the National Guard and plans to meet with President Trump about all of this today. Good morning, Congressman.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
What are you going to share with the president when you see him today?
Well, I want to talk about what I saw. I was down there in Tucson, so I went and saw the overall operations as well as was part of the overall operations. And what I saw was a really bad situation, something that I think is deserving of a national emergency, not because of the immigration issue, but because of the drugs and the human trafficking. If you think about the cartels, the Sinaloan or the Zetas, they basically make money on two things. One is trafficking humans. The other is trafficking drugs, both of which are over the border.
Yeah.
And I saw that lots of people die every year as a result of coyotes running and abandoning them. And so I think it's important to share that.
But just explain to us how 200 miles of a new border wall will stop the 90% of heroin and other drugs that come through the legal ports of entry on the southern border.
Well, it's two different issues. So, yes, you have the port of entry issue. So if somebody can get a semi through filled with drugs, that's the way they'd prefer. And so everybody that opposes the active duty deployment to the border, not to be confused with the Guards deployment, but the active duty is on the border hardening these ports of entry, which my friends on the other side of the aisle say is the problem, so they should be supportive of that. Secondarily, there are drugs that come over the border outside of the port of entry. There's also human trafficking. All you have to do is look at the numbers. It's a fact. So what a border wall does is it shrinks the amount of border you have to actively monitor. So, for instance, in Arizona, you would have a predator that would go over, have like one radar sweep, and it would see all these different groups that have crossed. And then they would prioritize. They only had one of our air assets, so they'd say, which group do we go after first? They'd put you on that group, and we'd coordinate Border Patrol. And it takes basically an entire shift to get one group because of the rugged terrain. So what you do is you shrink the amount of the border you have to monitor, and then you can focus your resources on that. I'll tell you, Allison, I did not work one area of the border in Arizona that had a wall because they weren't going over it.
Congressman, because you have experience with this and because you're a veteran, I do want to ask you about the priorities. And, these are real life choices that have to be made. This isn't monopoly money. This is money that was assigned to other things that the president will take for the border wall. And so one of the things that it was assigned for is military housing. And as you know, there's been all sorts of reporting lately about the horrible, squalid conditions that our servicemen and women are living in military housing. So are you comfortable taking the part of the $8 billion from them to build the border wall?
Well, the first $2.5 billion comes out of counter-drug, DOD counter-drug, which this obviously is a counter-drug issue. So what we allocated plus the counter-drug, if they get through that, I'm not sure if they can get through that by the rest of the fiscal year, then they can go to what's called MILCON VA. Now, MILCON is not necessarily veteran housing or military housing. It can be for construction of a new front gate or a new squadron ops building at any base. So prioritizing that funding is going to be important. Also, military housing now is private contracted. So where we need to make sure when veterans are living or when military members are living in houses with mold and bad conditions, we need to hold those private companies accountable, that we basically give what's called BAH, basic allowance for housing, to those companies to keep those soldiers and airmen.
But just so I understand, to be clear, you're saying that no money will come out of military construction or military housing for the border wall. You're sure?
No, what I'm saying is when it comes to military construction, there's any number of things that involves. So as the administration, if they get to that pot of money, prioritizes, my guess is they'll look at what is not important. The construction of a new front gate is nice at an Air Force base. It's probably not the most important thing. So I am very comfortable that the executive branch will take a look at what the high priority and low priority is. But also keep in mind, the housing is done through private contracting. Those people need to be held accountable to the bad conditions because they're taking money from these soldiers and airmen and Marines and sailors, and they're giving them bad standards of living.
Absolutely. I mean, and as long as you're sure that's not what the White House is about to do also and take money away from them. Also, the new numbers out by Customs and Border Protection are staggering. And what it shows is that the numbers have spiked in February in terms of apprehensions at the border, and it's a humanitarian crisis. I mean, it's families, as we know, showing up. It's unaccompanied minors showing up. And so part of the strategy to deal with that is to deal with it at the point of origin, the countries, Guatemala, Honduras, where people are living in this abject poverty. So again, since they're showing up and presenting themselves, often at legal ports of entry, how is the border wall going to stop the humanitarian crisis that's happening?
Well, I don't think it's going to stop because they know how our asylum laws work. It spreads throughout the community. I don't think they're going to stop that from happening. What we can mitigate, and every way we can mitigate this is important, is the human trafficking over the border. So the coyotes, which are the drug cartel leaders, basically the guides that come over, and the drugs being stopped at the border. Now, when it comes to our asylum laws, I think we need to fix them. Allow people to file for asylum in their own home country. I think that's a way to do it safely. Here's the thing. People look at the border wall and have said, well, the border wall is immoral or uncompassionate. I actually see it very differently. I think having a secure border where people know that if they make the journey, they're not going to be able to cross, actually gives people the opportunity to do this the safe and the right way. And we need to have a generous immigration system. I'm all for it. I'm all for comprehensive immigration reform. But right now, paying the drug cartels to move people into Arizona and then abandoning them if they hear a chopper blade or think the CBP is near and they run and leave them to die, that's not compassionate at all.
Congressman Adam Kinzinger, we appreciate you coming on with your perspective. Thanks so much.
Anytime.
Thanks for his service. He did just get back from a tour, there on the border there in some National Guard.